Hi, everyone. We're going to give a few minutes to let folks get into the Zoom. A few more minutes, a few more seconds for folks to join in. Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Sarah Axelson. I'm Vice President of Advocacy with the Women's Sports Foundation. We're so thrilled to have all of you with us today to discuss our conversation, the impact of strong policy and sustainable infrastructure for women's sports. This is a virtual parallel event for the Commission on the Status of Women, this year's CSW 68. So today we are so thrilled to have our guests with us today to have this important conversation. And I want to give a little bit of time for each one of our panelists to introduce themselves and share a bit about their work. So first, just to start from myself, again, Sarah Axelson, she, her pronouns, Vice President of Advocacy with the Women's Sports Foundation. Women's Sports Foundation is a national nonprofit based here in the United States that seeks to advance opportunities for girls and women in sports through advocacy, research, and community programming. We were founded by Billie Jean King in 1974, and we are set to celebrate our 50th anniversary in a little over a month. And so we are very pleased to be a part of this conversation with our colleagues. And I will turn it over to Rachel to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about the work that she's doing.
Kia ora, kia ora Sarah. Ena mana, ena waka, ena reo, iro rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Rachel Froggatt. I am dialing in today from Melbourne, Australia, but I'm in fact a New Zealander, and many of you I think probably will know my name as the previous Secretary General of the International Working Group on Women in Sport in the Secretariat that was hosted in Aotearoa, New Zealand from 2018 until the end of 2022. A little bit of, I guess, career history to set up the conversation today. I'm so excited to be on this panel and so honoured to be alongside such amazing leaders as Sarah, Alison and Payoshni, all of whom I've worked with before, so it is a privilege to be with them here. And I'm really excited by the fact that as a team we made the decision that this was an open floor panel discussion, that we were going to encourage you guys to ask us as many questions as you like, to jump in, because all of my learnings from having been in the Women in Sport movement over the last 5 or 6 years is that change comes through discussion. In fact, change inspires change was our catchphrase for the entire Secretariat here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, encouraging people to really share with each other what they're doing, whether it be small, whether it be large, because everybody learns from everybody else. A bit of history on me. So I spent the first 15 years of my career in very blue chip commercial men's sport on the agency side, and 7 seasons in Formula One. Did a lot of work in European football, cricket, rugby, PGA, and really, I guess, had an epiphany moment, you might call it, in 2012 when I was living in Germany, in Munich at the time, and was working for Allianz. And Allianz had a very large sponsorship portfolio, including the International Paralympic Committee. And I worked on the London 2012 Paralympic Games. And many of you will remember that that was the games that was very much the coming of age of the movement. It was that moment, it was Meet the Superhumans. It was an extraordinary moment in time where perceptions of disability across Great Britain changed on a dime through this exceptional campaign. And I remember just being so blown away by the idea that sport could be used for social development to improve the position of underprivileged groups within society. So it sent me in a very different direction. I came home to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to be the commercial and marketing director for the New Zealand Paralympic team for about 4 years through the Rio 2016 Games and Pyeongchang 2018, and really did a lot of work in the national space and international space to advance the rights of disabled people through sport. And that brought me through actually until becoming the chief executive of our startup baby Women in Sport Aotearoa Advocacy Agency. Certainly not celebrating 50 years, Sarah, but we are celebrating about 7 years now since our first iteration or idea of creation of an advocacy agency in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I was given the task of setting that up, taking the vision and the strategy of the organisation forward. And that included the staging of the IWG World Conference on gender equality and sport. So I'm sure we'll talk about that conference and lots of the other themes over the 5-6 year period in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which was a period of really significant change. And I really look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And so great to have you with us. Now we will shift to Allison.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Hello, everyone. I am speaking to you from Canada, and specifically a city named Calgary in Western Canada, home of the '88 Winter Olympics. And I'd like to first take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot First Nation tribes of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I am the CEO of Canadian Women in Sport. We have been around for 43 years. I have not been part of it for all of that. I'm about 8 years into my journey with the organization. And I think born from as part of a very similar cause as the Women's Sports Foundation, really a recognition that we had so much work to do to ensure that girls and women had equal or equitable opportunity in sport, knowing all the benefits that sport brings to individuals, to communities, and to our societies as a whole. And so our work has really been focused on systems change. So specifically trying to make the sport and physical activity systems in Canada much more inclusive, much more equitable for girls and women to participate and to lead. And in doing so, to be empowered within sport, but also through sport, really recognizing that sport can be a platform for so much opportunity for women and girls across our societies. So our work, again, relatively similar to the Women's Sports Foundation, focuses first on research. Everything that we do is grounded in evidence, and these insights are really a springboard into action, specifically widespread advocacy for change for women and girls in sport. Certainly some of that advocacy is directed at government and government policy and investment, but we are advocating broadly across the sport system for folks to take up the ideas and the actions that will really affect lasting change in our country. And then we work on programs and solutions, because we know that good ideas are a great place to start, but sport organizations and leaders really need support to put those ideas into action. And so we work extensively at every level of sport and physical activity in this country, directly with hundreds of organizations and thousands of leaders every year to help them take those steps forward from wherever they are in this moment. How do they move forward and make progress to be the leaders and the organizations that really reflect the diversity of our communities and serve everybody equally well?
Thank you, Allison. And finally, Payushni, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel, having had opportunities to interact or work with each of you. And I'm so grateful to the Women's Sport Foundation also because of, in a way, building my own foundation in a way, because I was an intern many years back at the Women's Sports Foundation, and I always like to mention that whenever I have an opportunity to do so. Currently, I am heading this newly formed organization called Humans of Sport. But I do have years of experience as an athlete rights activist, mainly working on inclusion-related policies, and having worked mainly in India, but also sort of working with athletes across African nations and Asian nations. I do wear other, many different hats, including being a director and trustee at the Center for Sport and Human Rights and a trustee at Women Win. However, here I'm representing Humans of Sport. I would love to share a slide if possible. Can you see it? So Humans of Sport, at the core of our mission is the commitment to provide unwavering, sorry, I can't see, support to athletes. So the core of our mission is athletes' rights. We aim to equip them with the tools of justice, livelihood, sustenance, and negotiation skills to combat discrimination head-on. This comes as, this has been created in order to sort of give structure to the work that I have been doing for the last 15 years with allies across the world, including someone who's one of the directors, Professor Bruce Kidd. I would also, like to just quickly mention the 3 ways we can work with any of you is assist individuals. So basically focusing on athletes once again, but we do also intend to advise in institutions, which I have been doing myself as an individual in the last 15 years, working with international governing bodies or intergovernmental organizations or national governments as well. And we also intend to amplify athlete voices. I'll stop there and let Sarah get the microphone again.
Thank you, Peyoshni. And just a huge thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. We're so thrilled to be able to continue our CSW participation through this virtual presentation, virtual panel. And thankful especially to Rachel and Peyoshni, who are joining us from all hours of the day. And so with that, I just want to get a quick take of our audience here and find out where everyone is tuning in from, so we have a sense of where folks are. Excellent. Well, it looks like a few responses are coming in, but the vast majority, no surprise, obviously, if we're, the ones organizing it, the vast majority of folks are tuning in from North America, followed by Europe, Africa, and Asia. So very happy to have you all with us today. And as was stated at the top, the Q&A is open. So if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A function, and we will hope to get to audience questions later today, later in the panel. So, a large, central assertion of this discussion is really about how crucial policies are to implementing social protection systems for girls and women in order to access sports. And so, Allison, I'm going to start with you because you used these words in your introduction, but what do you see as the particular value of policy in the fight for systems change?
Okay, here we go. Let's do this. So when we think about the way that change is happening and has happened for women and girls in sport, and the broad sort of lasting change to the systems itself that we're trying to drive. So this isn't necessarily talking about program interventions here or there, but actually changing the system and tackling some of the biases that have, I would arguably say, been baked into the system, right? When we think about the history, I'm channeling Bruce Kidd here, Peoshni. When we think about the history of sport, the women have made enormous contributions, and access has grown tremendously over the decades. It really has started and has persisted as a very male-dominated space, informed by the worldviews and the experiences, first and foremost, of men. And that is embedded throughout the way that sport is designed and operated at an institutional level and at a cultural level. Again, acknowledging that great change has happened, but still many of the barriers that girls and women are facing are rooted in those deeply embedded biases within our sport organizations and system as a whole. So when we think about one of the greatest tools that we have to change it, not in little bits and pieces in incremental ways, but to change it in a much broader way, and ideally in a lasting way, policy can be a very effective tool for that. But of course, anything that has the potential to create significant change is also going to be more difficult to achieve, and a significant lift also, not just to create the policy, but actually to ensure that that policy has the desired effect. So it can be a really effective tool in big and small ways, but it needs to be approached, I would argue, with a lot of strategy and a high degree of commitment to see the whole long tail of the policy effort.
Absolutely. Rachel, Peoshni, either one of you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to give everyone a little bit of a landscape of the experience in Aotearoa, New Zealand around this, because it's probably one of the strongest case studies in the world to demonstrate the impact of policy on the protection and the growth of women's sports. So context-wise, if we scroll back to sort of late 2016, when our movement really began here, and it was the emergence of Women in Sport Aotearoa, and I'd like to acknowledge the board of that organisation and the new CEO, Nikki van den Bos, as well, a very good friend of mine who stepped into the role behind me. And this piece of work was done to enable a voice primarily into government to lobby and advocate for the rights of women and girls within sport. And it was coming from a place where it was very apparent that the inequities across the system, to Alison's point, were baked into a large extent. And so the vision that the organisation had was to bake in change into the system through the policy that was built. So over a period of time, we were fortunate in one instance where we had a change of government. So we moved across to a more centre left leaning Labour government, and a Minister for Sport, Grant Robertson, who is a saint in our country to anybody that is associated with the women in sport movement. His very first public meeting as minister, he made a commitment to women's sport, and that was in November of 2018. And he was, 2017, and he was absolutely rigid in that commitment throughout the entire 6-year tenure that he held the sports minister role. And that was a period of really traumatic change for the world with the COVID pandemic. We were in a system where there was a lot of panic, where sport really fell apart, where professional sport wasn't able to be staged. And I think that one of the main reasons he was able, and the system, including Sport New Zealand and High Performance Sport New Zealand, were able to hold the line was because of the policy work. So to explain, they put a women and girls in sport and active recreation strategy and system in place in 2018. And it was a New Zealand-wide system. And what was really interesting about what they did and what we advocated for in the background is the policy was there, but there were also consequences for the sports if they didn't adhere to the policies. And the most probably public version of that was women on boards. And so we introduced a quota system, a 40-40-20 approach. And every national sport organisation in Aotearoa that received funding from government had to meet that quota by the end of 2021. And if they didn't, they had their funding withdrawn. Every single one met that except for one organisation. Anybody that's familiar with New Zealand will know which one didn't meet that that quota system, and they did lose money. And interestingly, I actually went on to work for that organisation for a little while last year on a consulting project, and noticed internally that it actually really bothered them. It wasn't so much about the money, because it wasn't financially an enormous amount of money that they lost because of the type of organisation they were, but they were embarrassed, and they were really mortified that they hadn't been able to reach that target and that they were being judged for that. So it was a really effective tool that enabled the system to really hold the line.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really interesting. And I remember hearing about that at the time, and definitely some things that I think we can learn from that, which will get us into the next question. But Payashni, I saw you come off mute. You have something to add in?
Thanks, Sarah. No, from my experience of working with organizations who work internationally and globally, I'll probably bring in a different perspective slightly, because it so much depends on where the country-specific policies are, as to at which point of women's sport development your country is, and what kind of policies are in place in your country. So at certain points, I have really believed that international initiatives to have policies, frameworks, guidelines, programs have really helped, especially certain programs related to UN organizations. For example, now we see the UNESCO launching Fit for Life program, and how I'm hopeful that it will have a huge impact at the national level in many different countries where they do not have policies supporting women's sport in place. So I think there is also the need to sort of look at the global, how globally through these intergovernmental organizations, or through the IOC, or through international federations, how we can sort of push for these policies in countries where such policies are a long way to come. So that would be my, yeah.
Yeah. And so, as we think about pushing for policies or improving maybe already existing policies, Rachel, I think you already touched on some of the main things, but curious from each of you, what you think makes for a good and effective policy, whether it's at the grassroots league or national governing body or level. Do you have examples of policies having tangible impacts on the access for girls and women? And so, Rachel, I know what I just heard from you is, having a little bit of teeth, right? That's one of the major things that people say about Title IX here in the States, right? It is a fantastic law. It has made great strides, but there really is not a whole lot of repercussions for schools that do not meet the requirements of Title IX. And we're now more than 50 years out from that law being passed. And so I think that is one of the challenges that we see, is when the policy has no way to actually, there's no, downfall for noncompliance or not meeting that policy, that it doesn't always carry the same weight as if there was a penalty involved. So yeah, curious what other examples are out there.
Yeah, I think for us, I think we did a very good job of creating a kind of carrot and stick situation in New Zealand, because we certainly didn't want to make sports or sports leaders feel terrible, that we were standing over them, and that all of, because, we do very much recognize that there are a lot of very good people, men and women in the system, who genuinely have the best of intentions, but perhaps are affected by unconscious bias, or lack of funds, or lack of infrastructure, or lack of coaches, lack of available systems and structures to support girls and women in Aotearoa. So we also tried, as well as having penalties associated with the policy, we also tried to create incentives to really support and encourage sports to move down this pathway. And part of that strategy, as I mentioned, the strength of the women and girls in sport policy was that it was pushed across the whole government system, which then led to quite a number of other government ministries then creating their own policies and approaches. So a really good example of this is New Zealand Major Events, which is an organisation that sits under the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, made a commitment to then bring the ICC Women's Cricket World Cup, the Women's Rugby World Cup, and of course the FIFA Women's World Cup to Aotearoa, New Zealand, alongside the IWG. And we kind of created what we called, I guess, an umbrella concept over the top, a really enormous shop window to really showcase the power of women's sport. And the 4 organisations came together in a collaborative effort called the Big Four, and I worked with the other 3 leaders underneath that. I'm very mindful, to Piyoshni's point, that this is the great fortune of a developed nation, the ability to actually bring these kinds of events here. But I think what it did for us, Auckland, New Zealand is the biggest Pacific city in the world. We have so many migrant inbound Pacific communities here, that then being able to create legacy programs underneath these 4 big events that then rolled out through the national sports organisations into local communities and into local clubs, which also brought a rolling stream of investment into those clubs, was really important to encourage participation as well. So we've seen, I was talking to the commercial director of Football New Zealand yesterday. They've seen a 25% jump in participation in football across Aotearoa on the wake of hosting the FIFA World Cup here, and the investment in the infrastructure and systems and structures to welcome girls into football. And football was not a particularly big sport in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's very dominated by rugby, by netball, by hockey, as kind of preferred sports. So it's a very interesting situation here, to your point, Sarah. And there were a number of things that we did, but what I would say, that having the strength of the policy there then enabled us to build, as I say, this kind of carrot and stick system around it.
Can I jump in? And
Yeah, please.
So I have an observation, because I was thinking about there's sort of government policy, and then but of course there's policies in grassroots organizations up to national sport federations and cutting across all the different spaces. And what makes government policy particularly interesting is that government also tends to be a funder of sport. And so there is that stick available, but also a carrot. You can play it in both ways. And I would say that similarly, although they play very different roles, having policies for sponsors and brands in the private sector who are invested in sport, in terms of how they're going to show up around gender equity through their investments, and how they're going to use their investments to affect change within the organizations. But the presence of funding in the relationship is a really interesting dynamic. And again, that's one of the reasons why government policy can be such an effective lever for change. And I would say not just in the threat of withholding funding if certain standards aren't met, but also when we're talking about policy change, we're talking about change, like it's change. And so when we think about change management and how to build buy-in and how to ensure that the change really takes root and is sustainable, sometimes trying to move an organization or a group of organizations from one status quo to a new normal, that requires investment. And so we always advocate, particularly when we're talking to our government partners here in Canada, that yes, let's raise the expectations here. Let's go for it. Let's invite people into another space with us. But how can we help them get there too? And because there can be a lot of resistance to change, right? We're talking about a space where there are scarce resources. We're just fulfilling what's immediately in front of them. The status quo consumes all of their energies and then some, asking them to do something that's new that they might not totally understand or feel like they have the competency or capabilities to deliver on can be really overwhelming, and the response can be pushback or just ambivalent, like just complete ambivalence. So like they're not gonna touch it. When we think about policy further into the system, like in the sports themselves, you know, we see national sport organizations forming policies that implement that influence and impact their whole system. But money actually flows up in Canadian sport from member dues at the grassroots up into the national sports. So they don't have that financial lever in most cases to play with. And so it requires a similar but different considerations around how to move policies through and how to get them to really take root. And I would say because there's minimal control and questionable degrees of influence, a lot of it comes down to buy-in and really persistent focus on implementation. It's rarely a policy made, compliance achieved. It's usually an ongoing process. And one organization that's done a really interesting job of that here in Canada that comes to mind is Ringette Canada, which is a team-based sport played on ice, kind of similar to ice hockey, but not. And it's a sport that's really dominated by girls, you know, often because they were not really welcome in ice hockey. But most of the coaches are men. And so to create those visible leaders for the girls who are influencing those environments for them, and to get more women into those spaces, they created a woman on the bench policy at the national level. And even just recently, we were talking with them and they were saying, you know, we really want to evaluate how it's going. And I would say the journey over the last several years with them that we've been witnessing is really a very iterative process. Okay, we have this policy. Some people interpreted it by the spirit, some have applied it by the letter. So you get a lot of like moms opening the door to let the players on and off the ice, but no actual coaching role, no authoritative influence, which did not really reflect what they were aiming for. So it's like, okay, how can we build more buy-in? How can we do more education? How do we measure and evaluate this to really understand perceptions on it? You know, like they're just investing a ton basically in trying to create this change. It may have started with policy, but policy was only the beginning.
Excellent. Thanks, Allison. Payashni, go ahead.
If I may add, you know, I'm going to talk about something that happened many years back. In 1980, India hosted the Asian Games. And even though, you know, we often, as even Rachel pointed out, the fact that several of these mega events that took place in New Zealand had an impact. And I think for even India in 1980, the Asian Games, which really was too costly for a country which was still dealing with lots of economic issues, yet it did have an impact in sport, obviously. And in 1984, the Sports Authority of India were created in order to sort of push for excellence in sport, but at the same time, it also created avenues for identification of talent at the, for youth talent, and which meant that, you know, there was actively an attempt to look for young people from across villages. Now, the other thing that often in my interactions with bureaucrats in India have heard is a medal doesn't have a gender. And therefore, you know, this whole initiative to identify young talent sort of equally made sure that there were enough girls as well as boys who were being included in these sporting hostels, which kind of till date is the basic structure of Indian sport, non-cricket, obviously, where, you know, you have these Olympic sports and you have young people from across the country, from villages, you know, who come and live there in the sport hostels and access education as well, which is all very connected. And this happens across the country, which had an equally positive impact, I believe, on women's sports as well, and we are gradually seeing benefits of that. I mean, there can be a lot that you can say to even criticize that particular sort of initiative, but there are some positives to it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also, worth mentioning just how different things can be country by country. I know the US is in a very particular situation, very different from most of the rest of the world in terms of how our United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee is structured. It's not really through the government, it exists through the government, but operates separately, which is really one of the only places, if not the only, that does it this way. But school sports are attached to our school systems, which gives us some leverage with Title IX. And so, the US, I think for sure is definitely a very has a unique sport structure compared to what I know I've heard from folks in the international space as well. But as it comes to the policies, right? Some of what I'm hearing from you all as you're talking through what has made for effective policy is also the ability to look at numbers, have transparency of data, to be able to track things, to be able to understand what compliance actually looks like. And so when it comes to that idea of, tracking compliance, enforcing policies, I'm wondering from each of you what the, best practices are that you've seen, or maybe even some lessons learned. So, from us here in the US, we do have Title IX, right? It's an anti-discrimination law with our education system, but because sports are in our schools, it applies to sports too. And it took many decades for us to get a transparency law on the books that essentially gave some sunshine to what the numbers actually looked like within the schools. And so once that part was passed, then we're able to say, okay, from a data perspective, we can see what participation opportunities look like. We know what, scholarship dollars look like, what recruiting expenses look like. But again, that only exists at the collegiate level. We don't have that at the high school level right now, right? So that's something that we continue to push for and continue to add to other versions of bills that come up that are similar. So I'm curious, what other types of reporting requirements, tracking, compliance, enforcement seems to have been effective in your worlds?
Yeah, I think if we look at New Zealand, I think this is a really valid place to start. And I think when the Women and Girls strategy came in, it was built on real numbers, and a lot of work had been done by Sport New Zealand and their research agencies and ourselves alongside to actually get a picture or a lay of the land of actually what was going on across the system. And one of the most important things that I think, and it sort of connects back to the previous discussion, is we very much looked at how we could support sport to move forward by giving them frameworks to work within, but also practical programming to deliver with KPIs associated with that. And so we broke the policy down into 3 areas. So women's leadership, women and girls participation, and value and visibility, which was a really critical issue here in Aotearoa as well, and I'm sure is around the world in terms of media coverage of women's sport. And I think that we, throughout the entire rollout of the strategy, periodically, there were numbers re-released. And what we found was that they actually provided a real incentive for people because they started to feel like they were part of our growing movement in Aotearoa and that their work had a contributing factor towards that. So as the numbers began to improve over time, as we saw more and more women come into, board positions, we saw participation numbers and very strategic pieces of work, particularly aimed at young teenage girls. We have a very large drop-off of young teenage girls around sort of 13 or so that fall out of sport, targeted initiatives into those spaces, and particularly targeted pieces of work into the media space. This one's in itself is a really interesting one because the global coverage of media in media of women's sport is about 4%. And we started in Aotearoa, New Zealand with 11%. And over the 4-year period, we're able to drive it really hard through 27% by the end of that 4-year period. But that in itself, and this is probably the next question in the line, Sarah, how do you maintain momentum once you start to have it, especially in the context of changing government? So we've just had a change of government in November of last year, and I think that in itself is quite interesting, maybe a point we can come back to a little bit later.
I think in the conversation about compliance, I could not agree more with the importance of data and transparency around that, because it's really easy to make a commitment to something and then nobody knows that it's happening, or if it's not happening, then there's no, then can just disappear, it can just sort of slide away into the background, sort of like me and my commitment to working out. And so I think that is really so valuable. It's definitely what when we talk to organizations about considerations and steps that they may want to take, is actually making a public commitment and then committing to tracking that publicly as well. And I think that for government in particular, that's so important, that the citizens and folks understand what came of that commitment. I would add to that we're going to have any conversation about compliance really needs to start way earlier. And I think this will be something I bring out throughout this conversation, is that a focus on compliance is probably going to read negatively for any organizations or individuals impacted by a policy. And the best way to get compliance is actually to gain their input in the policy, to consult them really extensively, and to ensure that as that policy comes forward, it comes forward in a way that really builds buy-in and alignment to that policy, so that organizations and leaders join in the commitment, join in the spirit and the intent of the thing, and comply willingly. I know that's not possible in every case, but having a process, I guess what I'm basically saying is process is going to be as important or even more important than just like kind of coming in with a policy and now dictating to everybody. Having a really good process is going to create the best outcomes, because at the end of the day, it's not about policy, it's about the outcomes. And so the more we can get people on board with it, the more we can have them coming along on that change management journey, the better results we're ultimately going to create.
I think for me, in the countries that I have worked, I have always faced that lack of data is a huge issue. Now, whether that is an issue is another question, because, a lot of times when you hear people from countries in the global south, we would always give you a lot of anecdotal references. There is a value to those references as well, and there is a value to those stories as well, because we do not have data to refer to. We refer to these stories that that sort of represents the situation that is. So definitely a lot of, I think, in these countries, a lot of us depend on, more sort of international and global policy making, as I just mentioned. For example, the IOC has these, Rachel, you were mentioning the 5 different aspects within women's sport, and the IOC has their gender equality policy referring to leadership, participation, media portrayal, safe sport, and I think the economics, resource allocation. And UN Women in their Sport for Generation Equality refer to similar kind of sort of division. And I think these have been important, and really, the more work is done through these organizations, I believe there is a sort of possibility of reaching out to more nations where certain, even the policies are not there. So the question of compliance doesn't really arise as of, as yet.
Yeah, that's fair, right? Like some of it is going to be getting policies in place before we can talk about compliance. And even, freshly made policy, it takes time to see how that gets enforced. We had equal pay for Team USA was just recently passed here in the States, and that was a real outgrowth of the push for pay equity, from our US women's national team, the soccer team, and others, the hockey, that kind of groundswell of support and pressure from the athletes, from the public on national governing bodies created the opportunity for policymakers to propose that legislation. And there was such support and sentiment around it that it was able to move through Congress, which, is one of the first bills in my, decade and a half of being here at WSF that actually got all the way across the finish line, right? There have been many worthy policies proposed, but it takes a special set of circumstances for those policies to actually make it all the way through into law and to become effective. Payushni, I saw you.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go.
Or shall I? Okay. No, when you said that the equal pay point, Sarah, I immediately thought of this BCCI announcement, the Board of Cricket Control in India announcement about equal pay. And we also need to see the layers within these announcements. Certain things they are announced because they really look good on paper, but they are actually not true. So when BCCI announced equal pay, it was just equal pay as far as match fees were concerned. But there were other things, like there were many other things that men's players do receive, including endorsements, blah, blah, blah. All of those things are not really included. It was just match fees, not the monthly salary, not the annual salary, not other kinds of support, financial support that they receive. So, there are often lots of layers to it. And now federations, even national federations or international federations, they have their communications team are at work to fool us, basically, to sort of give us these data which is not necessarily correct if you delve into it.
Yeah, it's always in the fine print.
Well, and similarly, your mention of equal pay made me think of something but a little bit different, which is that I guess still in the space of compliance, but of course what we want is we want a policy and then we want widespread implementation and adoption, right? Like that is the dream. What policies also do though, is they put an official obligation on the books. And for when those obligations aren't fulfilled, it does give recourse to people who are impacted by that. So when we get, so we receive, as I'm sure others do, like emails and whatnot, like with grievances about an experience or a treatment by a given organization. And one of the first things we do is we go look at their policies. And when there's a policy on the books, it changes the conversation than when it's silent on that topic. And of course, it can go as far as legal action, but it does create an accountability. Whether that accountability is being followed through on, it at least exists, and it does give people who are seeking equity and seeking inclusion an official place to start from in advocating for themselves or for others, which is, not the ideal, but it is one of the values that policies represent.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have an interesting dynamic, which I think is probably seen around the world as well. The Olympic and Paralympic sports are equitable in terms of pay because the athlete system here runs through a series of grants that are given to athletes that are coming through the system at different levels of the pathway. And it's completely ungendered, in the sense that wherever you are in the system, that's the, I guess, level that your funding is set at, depending on kind of where you are at. And so that makes it kind of quite interesting in the sense of that end of the spectrum. I think kind of where the frontier is, I suppose, if you call it that, really is in the professional sports system here in Aotearoa, which there are still enormous can't get the word out, discrepancies between the men's end of the system and the women's end of the system. And actually, interestingly, the reason I'm actually in Melbourne this week is I'm at Sport Next, which is a very large commercial sport conference held down here in the Pacific region. And interestingly, it's been a 2-day, quite intensive conference with about 1,000 delegates from across the Australasian sports system. And women's sport came up again and again and again and again in almost every session, every panel, every discussion. And what's been interesting, the iteration over the last 3 years, the third year that I've been to this, is how quickly ideas in the commercial space are evolving around women's sport, and how the acceleration, particularly in the Australian market, around equal pay for professional athletes in the context of the Matildas and the success that they had within the FIFA World Cup has been quite extraordinary. And so when you've got, one panel really stood out. There was a panel around media rights, broadcasting rights of sport, and they had 4 major broadcasters from the Australasian Pacific got up, and they almost came to fistfights, on stage over the value of, pay TV rights versus free-to-air rights, and what is the equivalent to an event of national significance, and the fact that content behind a paywall makes it less equitable for people to access. And for the first time, women's sport was in that argument. This argument wasn't about where the men's football World Cup was going to be played, but where future women's football World Cups were going to be played, and that they should be on free-to-air. And I loved that. I loved what we were seeing in that finally the commercial space is starting to clock the opportunity, and which means I think that as time goes past, we'll start to creep towards pay equity for our athletes in the commercial space as well as in the Olympic and Paralympic space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, here in the US, we've seen many, starts of seeing progress, and then it seems like it peels back a little bit. But what it feels like is happening now is that it really is a shift where we're on a fast track, and it's globally as well. It's not just here in the US. And so it's really exciting to see that. I was part of a panel earlier that we were saying some of the same things, and just the record viewership numbers that we're seeing in women's sports. And that's even when some of the sports are behind paywalls, hard to find, right? Like fans are finding women's sports, they're engaging. Super exciting stuff. Off track from policy, but very, very exciting. We could talk for a long time here, I'm sure. But before we move to audience questions, so please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. We will get to them. We have one question for each of you before we go over to the audience Q&A. So Rachel, I'm going to come back to you. The work that you've done in New Zealand with IWG and now with your new organization, what policy changes have you seen kind of coming to fruition after hosting the Big Four, which you mentioned: cricket, soccer, Rugby World Cup, and IWG?
Yeah. So about 15 months ago, I as I often say, sidled out stage left after a nearly 5-year engagement as CEO of Women in Sport Aotearoa and IWG Secretary General. And I stepped out and actually created my own organization. And what I'm doing now as an independent consultant and director is working across the sports system to help them generate revenue where they can then invest it back into social change and social impact programming. And that's been a really important part of kind of my own personal journey, is that I wanted to be able to take everything that I had learnt over the 10 years in sport for social development into these organizations. And so the work I've been doing has been in the women's rugby space, women's basketball, Paralympic sport, youth development, inclusion spaces. And what I guess I think is really interesting as a kind of legacy outcome from hosting the Big Four and having the policy work, really strong policy work in place. And I've actually been traveling this week with the chief executive or the group chief executive of Sport New Zealand and High Performance Sport New Zealand. And we had got caught in a traffic jam, as you do, in Melbourne a few days ago. And we had a very long conversation about the ongoing legacy effects of having the Big Four and the policy. And her position was really interesting, is that because of so much work having gone in and so much commitment to embedding policy across the system, encouraging, you know, carrot and stick behaviors around engagement across the sports system, that so many of those behaviors are now embedded, and actually the role of government, the role of advocacy organizations is starting to shift to continuing to encourage that movement. But actually they're bringing a new strategy now post the government change, where rather than having a women and girls strategy, you know, siloed as a particular piece of work, it's now been actually turned into more of a landscape proposition where it's being washed through every single piece of work that's been done at a government level. So they might be out talking to sports about participation and women and girls as a topic within that. They might be talking about safe sport and women and girls as a topic within that. They might be talking about coach development and women and girls as in that. And I think that's an incredibly interesting evolution, because it's now so expected and so widely kind of accepted across the system. It's become sort of embedded. And I think for me, that's what really protects women and girls in the long term, because as one of our very famous female athletes said the other day, governments will come and go, but policy will endure. And I think it's incredibly important to make sure that that continues for us into the long term as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Rachel. Allison, can you tell us a little bit more about the Canadian Women in Sports Gender Equity Policy Template? How did this come about and what has implementation looked like?
Yeah, thank you. I think the genesis generally for that tool and others is really acknowledging that, to my comments earlier, we work in a sports system that is just really strapped for time and resources, but also where there are such tremendous competencies across so many different elements within sport. But gender equity has not necessarily been one of those competencies that you will find in many organizations. And so we work on that across many different fronts. But when we talk about, the programs or the solutions that we offer, sometimes just giving people a start can really reduce the barrier that they feel in pursuing this work. If they don't feel like they have the expertise, if they don't feel like they have the time, of course, things can feel really overwhelming just to take that first step. And so the template is really that. It's always a work in progress for us. We're always returning to it with the things that we learn. But it's designed to help give people a place to start. What we don't want to see is people just putting their logo on it and writing their name through and like, here we go. Because of course, as we've talked about, there is a process to this, and the piece of paper is with the words written on it is perhaps the least important part of it, but the whole journey is what really is going to generate the result. But if this can help reduce a barrier to an organization moving in that direction, we see it as a real positive. And the fact that it's sort of self-serve is helpful too. We do much more in-depth programs and work and very hands-on stuff with organizations as we have the funding to be able to do it. But we also want folks to just be able to come to our website anytime and be able to access things that can help them move along. So I had a conversation with a young leader in, I think it was judo, if I'm not mistaken, who was working at her grassroots club to help them better support girls being in the sport and staying in the sport. And she said, yeah, we have a policy and we used your template as a starting point. And I was like, perfect. That is what that is all about. And so, yes, so maybe some of the bigger organizations are going to hire firms and they're going to, or they've got the capacity to really build these things from scratch in-house. But particularly for those smaller organizations or just people looking to get a head start on this work, what's one thing that we can do to help them along the way?
Yeah, and I think the thing that comes to mind when I'm listening to both of you is just the idea of intentionality, right? Like whether it's empowering others to be intentional in the work that they're doing, or that discussing gender equity, discussing women's sports becomes intentional from the start. And I think that's a really big shift that will help change the landscape for sure. Peyoshni, you've spent the large majority of your career working to create inclusive policies for girls and women, especially marginalized athletes. Can you speak to what these experiences have been like and how your thoughts on how others can ensure that their policies are inclusive for all?
You want me to read a whole book that I have not? Uh, but I just wanted to add one thing to Alison's points, that I really absolutely love the work that CWS has done, especially the guidelines on intersectional approach to gender equality. I mean, intersectionality is something which is so crucial. And I think the sort of guidelines you have for sport bodies in Canada are absolutely, something that globally one should sort of try and replicate. Having said that, to your question, Sarah, it's the work that I have done, and as I think of it, is more about dismantling bad policies rather than creating policies, to be fair. So it's a different kind of take, because when you try to have a dialogue, when you try to change policies, work internally, and it doesn't work, it doesn't really, nobody is hearing what you're trying to say, what do you do? And at that point, you take these international federations to the court, because that's your only way. The only way left to you is that. And I think I have done that quite a few times with athletes, with fantastic champion athletes who are willing to take that plunge, with allies across from Canada, from US, from across the world. And so we have, as many of you may already be aware of, that we challenged the hyperandrogenism regulations of the World Athletics in 2014. That was Dutee Chand from India. And we got a favorable response, and it pushed World Athletics and International Federation to change their regulations from what they had, because their scientists were not able to provide enough scientific evidence to back the regulations that they had brought into practice 4 years before we were sort of having this hearing in 2015. And therefore, they had to change it and make it very narrow to middle distance races only. It wasn't exactly what we wanted, but it was a step forward, and it led to several athletes competing at the Rio for the first time without being asked to undergo testing, or without being, scrutinized by these federations. And there was a lot of media trial. That's another story. And we know that we have gone 2 steps ahead. We have gone 5 steps back. It has been a long history. But it's also important to see, that sometimes sport, because of how it has been structured, institutionalizes discrimination. And at that time, how do you question that? How do you dismantle that? How do you challenge that? It becomes tougher in sport, because in sport we have this tendency to follow a certain rule, because sport is about rules in many ways. So even for athletes, even for people, individuals within sport, to question an existing regulations, to question an existing policy becomes difficult. But I think that is key to the kind of work today we are doing across the board, all these organizations, about empowering the athlete. And empowering the individual in sport, rather than, because institutions have always been very powerful, and there is a clear hierarchy when it comes to an institution and an individual. And to sort of topple that is another part of this work. I hope that kind of gives you some it's more about challenging, it's more about dismantling things than really building things. But yes, I mean, if you want to have everyone, if you want to be inclusive in sport, if you want to include, it's important that these bad policies should go.
And I think as well, to add to that point, I think, Piyoshi, you make a really good point about empowering the individual. For all of those people that are listening today to this conversation, one of the beautiful things about the strength of the women in sport movement globally is how much collaboration happens between all of the different organizations, countries, people. And I think if you are, depending on where you are in the development in your country, your local advocacy agency, if you have one, something like Women in Sport Aotearoa, have a lot of systems and tools and case studies and toolboxes that you can, get access to, social impact projects that they're running locally. Women's Sport Foundation, I've just had dinner with Women's Sport Australia yesterday and was talking to them about some of the work they're doing within the federal and state system here in Australia. But another really good resource to have a look at is the IWG, and a quick shout out, I think she's on this call, Lisa O'Keefe, the new Secretary General who stepped into the role after me for the UK Secretariat. She was very keen for me to encourage you all to have a look at the Brighton Declaration, which is the longest standing treaty to support gender equality into sport. Hundreds of organizations around the world have now signed that and made that commitment to the different principles of the treaty. And, we see that tool used at so many different points in the pathway, whether you're at the very beginning and you make a commitment through the Brighton Declaration to beginning a journey, whether you're a long way through it and you're wanting to refresh and recommit, it really is a very powerful tool, something recognised worldwide. And then one of our legacy projects from the New Zealand Secretariat was the establishment of an insight hub on the IWG website, where you can actually go in and see case studies and toolboxes from all around the world that are self-submitted by organizations to, really share with one another what's going on, what opportunities there are to inspire and encourage people to do more and more. And of course, my favorite note, I wouldn't be doing myself a service if I didn't encourage people to go to the IWG World Conference, which is next going to be staged in Birmingham in 2026. If you can't make that journey in person, one of the beautiful things that came out of COVID, so few that there were, is this hybrid approach that we now take with the conference, and you can dial in virtually from wherever you are in the world and access hundreds of speakers, hundreds of topics, hundreds of pieces of advice, case studies, toolboxes that you can use as well.
Excellent. Yeah. And, it was being in New Zealand for IWG was absolutely fantastic, and look forward to going to Birmingham with all of you in 26 for sure. Rachel, you mentioned the Insight Hub. And so this question, I think, builds off of that a little bit, but looking for all of you, these are audience questions now, so feel free to drop in the Q&A if you have any additional questions. We'll get to as many as we can with the limited time we have left. But, the question is about how effective is research to push for policy changes, particularly for continents that are lagging behind, and are there support facilities available for women who wish to lobby and influence policy changes in their country?
Lisa's just sent me a text message going, "You're a star." Hi, Lisa. And she'll be shouting at the camera going, yes, there are lots of support systems. Absolutely. And I think really starting with the premier organizations, I mean, this collaboration thing's so big. I mean, Alison, I was talking to Nikki Vandenbos, who's the Women in Sport Aotearoa CEO, about the beautiful collaboration with the Canadian Women in Sport, and actually leaning into your tools and systems, and actually you're allowing us to borrow a piece of kit that you actually spent a long time developing and adjusting it for our local landscape, especially around our Indigenous and Pacific communities, which is an incredibly powerful thing to be able to do, because if we started that piece of work from scratch, we'd be years away from having that tool available to our system. And we're incredibly grateful that Canada sees the value in the collaboration and the sharing of those tools and systems. So to your point, Sarah, yes, absolutely. There are so many organisations like the Women's Sport Foundation, Canadian Sport, Women's Sport Australia, Women's Sport Aotearoa that you can reach out to. And of course, the wonderful IWG. Hi, Lisa.
Piyushni, you talked earlier about, the case studies, but maybe not necessarily having the research, especially in Global South. You want to talk a little bit more about that and the research that does exist and what's particularly helpful?
I think there are plenty of scholars also present. I do see some people. There is a lot of work ongoing at this point. There was a time when they were we talk about co-creation of knowledge these days. I don't think that had happened earlier when, often people, scholars and researchers from global North countries visited countries in Africa and Asia and did sort of research, but did not really give back. But there wasn't a process which was about co-creating knowledge. And I think that is happening at this point. Gradually, there are lots of collaborations. So obviously, I'm more hopeful at how things are moving right now. And we have some great sort of collaborators, our allies from Africa and Asia, where I have worked mainly in the global scene right now, if that answers your question, Sarah. But yes, to add to Rachel's point that yes, IWG is a great network, and for anyone who has questions about how to get support, I think International Working Group on Women in Sport would be a great place to reach out to.
I would also underscore something that you shared earlier, Payashni, which is that when we talk about data often, it's the quantitative, the numbers that come to mind. Do we have numbers to back up our case for change? And while those are incredibly valuable, in the absence of those, but even if those are available, stories, anecdotes, I think we can't underestimate just how powerful those are, particularly when we're trying to persuade people in political office. Stories go a really long way and can help to make a difference. And for us, in the absence of Canadian numbers, as much as we always like to have data from our own country, our own jurisdiction, certainly looking at numbers from other comparable countries around the world can be a starting point in helping to build that case as well. And then we rely quite a bit on university partners, be they actual formal partnerships or just super keen, undergraduate or graduate researchers who want to take this up. So we're not necessarily investing in all of the research that we have directly. I think increasingly we've kind of seen the value and seen and made the commitment to keep investing, but being able to team up with researchers or feed them ideas. Here's a project that would be really useful, because I think what we find with the research community now, particularly younger researchers, they want their research to make a difference. Yes, they may want to get their publications and climb the ranks in the ivory tower, but so many of them also want to know that the work that they're doing is positively influencing the world. And so those collaborations can be really mutually beneficial.
Excellent. Thanks, Allison. So I think we have time for about one more audience question before we move into some closing thoughts. This one is about diversity and inclusion, gender equity within sports leadership. So the ongoing challenge that we see of achieving gender equity in sports leadership, what strategies or initiatives do you think can be most effective in cultivating a diverse and equitable pool of visible female leaders, whether that's coaches, senior staffs, board members, et cetera, especially in the face of varying levels of, barriers that exist. And I'll say, here in the States, we saw prior to Title IX, 90% of coaches of women's teams were women. And as soon as Title IX was passed, we saw shifts in, how people were hired, how coaches were hired, the desirability of coaching women increased, the pay increased. And suddenly you went from 90% of coaches being women to now that number is about 41% of college coaches of women's teams are women. So the pool has grown bigger, right? There are more women's teams to be coached, but we've certainly seen that challenge post Title IX of really diversifying the ranks of coaching, the ranks of athletic directors, conference commissioners, heads of NGBs. I have some thoughts, but I want to throw it to you all first and see, what you think can be some effective policies in the hiring and employment of people within sports.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of success here in Aotearoa with the board quota system, in terms of encouraging women onto boards. That does come with some challenges, though. There was some pushback at the beginning, about this. It drives me a bit wild, but this idea of tokenism and, we're just gonna put a woman there because we've been told to. It's absolutely rubbish. And some of the work that we actually had to do was to unpick some of those assumptions and actually educate sports organizations about the barriers that they place to women actually even putting themselves forward for leadership or governance positions. And, things as simple as, board meetings taking place at 7 o'clock in the morning, when we still live in a system and a culture where the mum is primarily the one getting the kids ready in the morning to go to school and things like that. So, mum not being able to join a board meeting at that time, or, the just really simple things that are illustrative perhaps of the differing roles that men and women still play in our society, and the systems and structures that the sports organizations were setting up without thought, without understanding actually what it is to encourage women to come into systems. I think it's got a lot better now, because we've had some women leaders really shoulder, I guess, the burden of stepping forward and being that first kind of frontier of women coming into positions, and really encouraging other young women to come in. We've had a lot of work done across some of the bigger NSOs around mentoring, around encouraging young women to come into associate board positions to actually learn and be a part of kind of the system without actually being a full member of the system, and that's been really valuable. There's been the emergence of women's leadership networking programming, mentorship type things that have really encouraged women to recognize that they are on a journey that quite a number of other women are also on, and actually exchanging ideas between themselves as well has been really great. But one thing that I guess I find interesting that I've observed just recently is we've always had a real struggle in the New Zealand system around female CEOs of national sports organizations. And throughout the entire sort of 5-year, 6-year journey we've been on here, we've only ever had about 8 or 9% have been female CEOs. And the really sad thing is a number of them have left in the last few months. And so that number's actually dropped. So even though we've progressed so far, we've actually in some ways gone backwards a little bit as well. And I'm really curious to unpick what's happening there, that these very senior, very experienced women are actually leaving the sports system and going back into corporate or other directions, and not staying in sport, what's happening there. So that, there's definitely still work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just even having that question of what's happening, right, and doing that follow-up to learn from it is really important as well. Peyoshni, what about you? Your thoughts?
Well, lots of thoughts again, but I had the opportunity to head an organization which was a global organization in Europe, and I didn't feel that I did feel that the appointment was correct, I would say, but I didn't feel they were ready for it. The thing that happens in Europe, especially in the global context, even though there are all these discussions, I don't see it's playing out really. So when you are having a woman of color, coming to lead an organization, are you prepared for it? What kind of support you need to provide? Because this person is coming from another part of the world where and you are sort of inviting them to this one of the richest places in the world to come and lead an organization. So I didn't feel, in my experience, I didn't feel supported. And I do think that it's not only about recruiting women. And again, I mentioned women of color, so intersectionality is important as well. Again, it's not only as an experience as a woman, but experience as a woman of color in a European country, where I didn't speak the language of, the local language either. So there are plenty of things that one can say. I think I would suggest this book. Was already looking for the link. This is the Feminist Killjoy by Sarah Ahmed, which gives you a great, I had to read that book after I had to leave that organization, and feel sort of supported, feel that I wasn't the only one. And so it's I don't think the world is yet ready. There is a lot of tokenism around, but they're not really ready for inclusion and respectful inclusion. You don't need to include us just because we are women of color. You need to include us when you feel that, you have to be respectful towards, and this is not only a matter of being a CEO in any organization, but I think it's also a matter of anywhere. I was recently in an Olympic Committee meeting, a National Olympic Committee meeting, somewhere in Europe, and I felt the same way, that there isn't respect when you're being invited. It's often tokenism, and therefore people don't even know, the organizers don't even know what you have done. And this happens over and over again as a woman of color trying to work in Europe. I never ever felt the identity of being a person. Growing up in India, I didn't feel this. I did feel that I was a woman because the cultural experience you have is very unique. Given how we normalize a lot of abuse and violence in our everyday life. But when I came to Europe, I did face racism, and I continue to face racism, and I continue to see how people are trying to sort of be inclusive, but only on paper. And
Yeah, that surface level inclusion that we see. And I think so much of it too, right, it's not just about a recruitment of diverse talent, right? It's about the retention and what are you doing to make sure that those leaders are welcome, to have that space. And also, we've seen that shift. It was D&I, then it was DEI. Now it's DEIB, right? I think that B for belonging, like making sure that folks are welcome. It's not good enough to have the token, to have the person with that intersectional identity to check the box. It's really making sure that everyone feels welcome. And that goes across the board. Allison, do you have any additional thoughts to add in here?
I will keep it brief, only to build on and to, or maybe to like echo what both Rachel and Peoshni said. And the way I would see it is there's two things really happening in parallel. One is we need to change the system, because there's nothing wrong with the women, right? It's that the system is putting all of these barriers in front of them, but that's going to take time. And in the meantime, we need women to have support to navigate and to survive, but hopefully more than survive, thrive in this space, navigating in a space that wasn't set up for them, and in fact is actively hostile to them at times. And so and absolutely, Peoshni, I couldn't agree more that I would say progress in Canada has disproportionately benefited white, cisgendered, able-bodied women. And so while we celebrate that progress, it is certainly not good enough. And I think the challenge of getting organizations to just wrap their heads around gender equality, not to mention intersectional gender equality, is quite a task, unfortunately, but it's one that we are committed to, and that I think as feminist organizations, we absolutely must work collectively towards that outcome. Otherwise our work is definitely not finished. But yeah, I would say also having targets really makes a difference. In our work with organizations, they say, okay, we want more women coaches. We're like, great. What have you done so far? Well, we did this coaching clinic for women. It's like, awesome. Okay, let's back it up and talk about vision and strategy. How many more women coaches do you want to have? At what levels? How long do you want them to stay engaged? Now, let's design strategies that are really going to generate that outcome. And those strategies typically need to look inward first, right? There's a lot of like, well, we need to do better marketing. It's like, why don't you look at what obstacles you might be putting in their way, so that when those women see that marketing piece, they would be responding to an organization that is really worthy of their time. And so there's different layers of work. We're really focused on that systems change people part of it. Other people are really focused on the mentoring and networking part of it, but it's all needed because there's long and short games here that we're playing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So now with the last few minutes that we have together today, wanted to have a brief moment for closing thoughts and just, if we could leave everyone with one best practice, right? When we're thinking about impactful policies based on your own experiences, what would be one best practice that you would make sure is on folks' radar as they're thinking about policies in their own worlds and countries, sports?
I guess my final comment would be, I think there's real optimism. I think people should feel really encouraged that we're moving in a really positive direction. And I think that in the context of, even in a post-COVID world, when we staged the IWG, we had 1,850 participants from 90 countries participate in that event, which gives you context of the scale of the movement that all of you are working within. And I think that sheer weight of numbers, sheer weight of expertise, sheer weight of commitment to achieving equity for women and girls, we will get there. We just have to keep pushing. And I think that probably from my perspective, reflecting on today's conversation, the one best practice piece for me, I think very much was starting with the data. So actually having the status quo before we dove into the change management that we pushed through. And I don't know if you call it best practice, but I think for me, the collaboration across the system in Aotearoa through the Big Four, and the fact that I had 3 other female leaders working alongside me shoulder to shoulder with enormous platforms of their own, was incredibly impactful and powerful. So I would say, find your posse, find your women that you can work shoulder to shoulder with, because I think it's really it will help you move a lot faster.
Shall I go first? Listen.
Go ahead.
I was thinking slightly differently again, and because of my years of work with athletes with sex variations, what I see today is not that optimistic. And there has been, there is this sort of backlash against inclusion of women with sex variations, as well as women, transgender women. So for me, the current space doesn't look as optimistic as I would have been a few years back. Even then, if you ask me about best practices, I think there have been some positive changes that we were able to have, with especially the IOC coming up with framework on inclusion, fairness, and non-discrimination. And that was quite crucial because it's a non-binding framework, again, but a framework nonetheless, which talked about important principles. It took a lot of work, but that you can have the IOC talk about bodily autonomy, no harm of athletes, talk about inclusion, talk about no presumption of advantage. These are the sort of some of the key principles in that framework. I think was quite positive. And in that process, they included athletes in the decision making. Athletes who were impacted by these policies in the decision making for the first time, which was quite a triumph. Having said that, it is non-binding, so obviously it has limited impact. But the conversations are still on. And one other thing that I noticed in this process was the 2 institutions which seem to be more receptive to an idea of inclusion as at all possible in sport were FIFA and the IOC. Both organizations had adopted human rights principles, and they had separate human rights departments, which helped gain this, helped us carry on with these conversations with these institutions. And I think that is also an important sort of learning as to approach things from a human rights angle might help include a lot of other issues when it comes to sport.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm gonna give a 30-second
Yeah.
answer because they've spoken so well. I would say that policy is a means to an end, not the end in itself. And it's only going to be as good as the implementation. So as hard as it is to get a policy on the books, that's just the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there are plenty of lessons to be learned from various parts of the world on different sports policies, and definitely recommend that everyone check out that Insight Hub that Rachel mentioned to learn from others, connect with others, reach out to like-minded organizations, even if they're not in your own country. I know our community is always so willing to share and to assist. Even as Rachel, you spoke about the work that Allison's doing and sharing some of that with you all as well. So, the work, gender equity in sports will be better as we all push for policies and implementation of those policies to help further that cause. And so it takes all of us. And so I just want to thank everyone, all of our panelists for being here today, for sharing their wisdom, everyone who tuned in. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate you helping us carry this mission forward, and wish you all a great day. Thank you so much.